A new recording. Okay, can you see
Yeah,
now?
it's on. Yeah. Everything
All right.
is fine.
Hello, Internet. My name is Chamomile.
And I'm Requiem.
Okay, so those dollar store plastic fangs were not an attempt to disguise yourself as Fang Requiem?
They were not. I feel like we've gotten closer since defeating the ghost of Sigmund Freud. And, I know you're into vampires and we're playing vampire, so I figured they fit the theme. I just,
And I guess I
I wanted,
appreciate the effort. Mainly, I'm glad to hear that this wasn't an attempt to disguise, because not only are those not very good vampire fangs, but also I watched you put them on. Like, viewers, we're in a hotel in Texas right now. I'm driving Requiem back to Arkansas since he recorporealized in Utah after we defeated the ghost of Sigmund Freud together. It's a long story. Don't even worry about it.
yeah, I'm sure nothing like that will ever happen again.
Probably not. I mean, that was pretty weird. It would be doubly weird if that happened twice.
Yes.
Or three
I
times, I
mean,
guess. I mean, if you're counting the Jade Empire thing, I mean, there was a very different tone to that confrontation, but I guess it was still pretty weird.
and I feel like vampires kind of call out for a Marxist interpretation, but I'm worried that you can't defeat Karl Marx with the power of friendship. He's a communist. Friendship's only going to make him stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I figured we could bribe him with brandy or something. Speaking of Marxism, I am shaking down this businessman whose car broke down in, like, I guess Santa Monica is the bad part of town. I don't know if that's accurate to LA or if it's just in the
That
world
does
of
not seem
darkness.
accurate.
Yeah, like, as far as I know, it isn't, but I've never been to that part of LA specifically. I've only briefly been to LA at all, so. But
I
yeah,
think I
I'm
think
just shaking this guy down. This is what we needed the intimidation for, so I could extort money from this business guy.
I'm pretty sure Santa Monica is like a upscale area. Like I'm
That
not
is my
actually.
understanding. But yeah, so we got 20 bucks out of him, and we also got a fancy watch. I can go pawn that in a bit, but first, the prince has directed me to go talk to some guy named Mercurio, who is the guy we just saw last episode, but climbing out of his car, leaving behind a trail of blood.
That's not conspicuous.
I mean, I guess it's not a masquerade violation if it looks like a regular mob hit.
That's true. The ghoul is very obviously their attempt at doing a Renfield equivalent.
Mercurio is a ghoul, by the way. Requiem knows this because he's
Yeah.
already played the game.
Oh yeah.
Which we're about to meet a
Yes.
ghoul, so there's a much more obvious ghoul in a bit too. So yeah, we'll get into that in a second. Right now, what we need to know is that this guy is a semi-mortal minion of the prince.
In Dracula, Mina kind of gets a special connection with Dracula after drinking his blood. I'm not sure where drinking a vampire. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. There are a lot of folklore where drinking vampire blood can cure diseases or stuff. So I don't know if that's where they're getting it from, or if there's a piece of literature that comes into play. It's been a while since I've read Interview with the Vampire, so I don't know if drinking vampire's blood it does anything in that. It might just be the folkloric thing, but it's kind of an obscure piece of folklore, and World of Darkness takes a lot more from movies than from actual folklore.
Well, I mean, which is fair at this stage, right? Like, the popular conception of the vampire is pretty far removed from the vampiric folklore right now, right? Like, the cycle has turned enough times.
It's absolutely fair. It's just it makes me wonder where they got this specific piece of lore from, like why they decided to have that be a thing.
Right.
I guess it's just Renfield, he doesn't. I guess he didn't seem supernaturally strong, as I recall. But it's Renfield's plot in uh, Dracula kind of doesn't resolve itself properly.
This guy's a fantastic voice actor, by the way.
Do we want to talk about our Dracula revision? I think that's a potential topic.
I mean, if you want to get into it, then sure. I'm trying to remember what it was, and
I remember most of it.
okay, fantastic.
You forget who you're talking to.
That's right. Yeah, you remember which version of a song was used on a game that you didn't play that came out when you were like 12.
So, Chamomile and I both read Dracula, and it's like the seminal vampire novel. It defines a lot of vampire lore, and we both are kind of in agreement that like the first half of Dracula works pretty well. So the whole stuff with Harker going to Dracula's castle and being trapped there, and the vampire brides, and figuring out that Dracula is a vampire, and Dracula arriving in England, and starting to feed on Lucy and her slow transformation into a vampire, and then the whole subplot when after she dies and is buried, it becomes the Blue for Lady and starts feeding on children, and then she gets staked. That's about the first, I think that's almost exactly 50% of the novel.
That sounds about right. It's been a while since I've read it, but yeah.
I read it like a couple months ago. And also it's me, so.
Right.
After that, the novel kind of hits a brick wall. Dracula becomes a lot more reactive in a way that's not super interesting. He's doing the trio goes around finding his soil, where he's hidden the soil from his grave, and they destroy it. They never really confront him, and then he runs off. He starts feeding on on Mina, but the urgency of that seems kind of weirdly downplayed. There's times when it seems like she's gonna turn into a vampire soon just because he bit her once. There's other times where well, it's not going to be until after you die, then you'll reanimate as a vampire. That kind of screws up the urgency of it. And the final confrontation with him in Transylvania is a real letdown. They just ambush his coffin and stake his body, and there's not an actual battle with him.
Right.
He becomes a lot more defensive and reactive for way too much of the novel.
The final confrontation in particular, seeing it, I remember thinking to myself, this was the smart way to kill a vampire, but it was not the dramatic way to end the novel. And I feel like it is an advancement in writing technology that it is now widely understood that you want to do the dramatic thing to end your novel. Figure out how to make it make sense that the dramatic thing happens, that the heroes have to fight Dracula, rather than the sensible thing, which is that it is much easier to kill a vampire while he is asleep in his coffin, so they do that.
Yeah. So there's the whole thing with Dracula having brought his grave soil to England. And there's a whole thing in when Harker is at Dracula's castle, Dracula has this whole thing about wanting to know about what England is like, and having a bunch of old English magazines, and stealing a bunch of Harker's clothes when he leaves. And it's kind of implied he's gonna eventually disguise himself as an English gentleman, but that never really goes anywhere. And what Camille and I have thought is really leaning into the idea of the vampire as the parasitic ruling class. So in Transylvania,
which they are very well suited for, by the way. That is a fantastic theme to lay on a vampire. On a vampire. Yeah.
So in Transylvania, the parasitic ruling class is the aristocracy. So in Transylvania, Dracula is an aristocrat. In England, he's the bourgeoisie. So his goal in England is not only to infiltrate England, is to infiltrate the bourgeois society, become part of the bourgeoisie, which makes the whole real estate drama that factors into a good chunk of the second half of the novel be a little bit more relevant. So once Dracula gets to England, he actually disguises himself as an English gentleman, and you actually do the vampire conspiracy. They don't actually get into it he doesn't actually do it once he's in England, but it's kind of even though it was implied that he would. So in this version, you would actually have him start trying to infiltrate English society, like it was implied he was going to. You would have like the last time Parker saw him, he was like this backwards Romanian aristocrat. The next time he sees him, he's dressed as an English gentleman. He's purchasing stuff in England because Harker was some sort of like real estate lawyer, and the whole reason he went to Transylvania was because Dracula wanted to buy real estate in London. And the reason he's bringing his grave dirt over is he needs to mingle it with the earth of England, and that will have some like magical ritual that will give him magical power in England. That'll make England his home soil.
Right.
Like you can imagine a confrontation with Dracula at some point where it's Dracula, but he's a perfect English gentleman now. He doesn't have a trace of an accent. And now that he's integrated into the bourgeoisie, he's part of the bourgeoisie, the superstructure of England now bends to protect him. The police are now on his side. The law is now on his side. Just the way in Romania, the peasants all sort of acted in his defense and were his servants. Now that he is in England and has done this magical ritual, now the police and all the institutions of bourgeoisie power are under his control. And it also lets you kind of up the stakes. And Camille and I didn't talk about this, but it's something I realized later.
Oh boy.
The reason he's picked England is not only because it's a feeding ground. If he takes power in England, he's basically ruling the world. England in 1897 controls like a quarter of the world's surface. I think like a third of the world's population is in some way under English rule. It's basically a world domination plot. You take control of London, you take control of England, you take control of the world. And probably, so you've got control of the...
You should be petting a cat a big white fluffy cat while saying this.
Because, there's some discussion, they're like, oh, he'll go, in Romania, he doesn't really have, a lot of people to feed on. He can go to London, and a lot of, I don't know how big London was in 1890. He goes to London, he's got, this city of several million people.
Yeah, it is pretty big. I forget exactly, but...
Not only does he have the city of, however many million people in 1890 it was, he has the entire world that he can now feed on because he has control of London.
Yeah, no, if he has control of London, then, he can just go rule India if the wind strikes him.
He's basically conquered the world. So
right.
You've got that way to raise the stakes. And, the final confrontation actually needs to happen in London rather than having him retreat to Romania. I understand, why you do that, but, I kind of like the idea. I don't know whether you would have, he buys a building in the heart of London, and then after he completes this ritual, it's sort of transformed into this, sinister, castle, or whether, I could also see him, buying a castle in the English countryside and restoring it, and it being, a castle that has, already has a dark history in England, and he sort of has integrated himself with that. Because I can also see him, he is a sorcerer. He went to Scholomance. That is a plot point in the novel. Because I also see him, summoning up, the bodies of, dead English villains. People who were, notoriously evil in English history, and having them serve him as well, now that he has stuck himself into English society this way. But you also, wherever the confrontation is, you want to... Because the battle with Renfield, everything with Renfield is a letdown, and everything with the brides is a letdown. Because the brides show up, and they're just sort of dispatched. You have those as sort of, the confrontations leading up to the actual fight with Dracula. It's you go to whatever his castle is, and first of all, you have to get past the English police, who are now at his beck and call. And then you have to fight Renfield, and then you fight the brides, and then you have your final confrontation with Dracula.
And you probably want to have the brides and Renfield confrontations happen simultaneously with the group split up between them, but yeah.
Yeah. And because at this point, the heroes are on the defensive. The Dracula has anywhere there's hierarchy and systems of domination, Dracula has power over that. And these systems of hierarchy and domination that is right as middle class English people they didn't see are now visible and being used against them. I don't know enough about English economics to know like the social standing of the characters because they kind of seem like they're working professionals. So I don't know if they're people who, like, if they lose their jobs, if they're ruined, like. I don't know if you had to be well off, like familially well off to be a lawyer or a doctor, or if the possibility of like losing, like if Harker now has his law license pulled and Seward has his medical license pulled, if they are ruined personally, but like if that is what it would be, that would be better for the story. And I also think like maybe like Van Helsing is being chased by whatever the English equivalent of customs is and wants to deport him. So that suddenly the ugliness of bourgeoisie society is now targeting them. Like I can see a scene happening where they're trying to confront Dracula and they're not able to, and just Dracula, because Dracula is now a perfect English gentleman. He's an unremarkable member of the bourgeoisie with a top hat and everything. And Dracula just being like, now if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the Prime Minister.
Right.
Because this he has this magical influence over structures of domination and power.
I don't know. Talk to me.
And you need to have an actual fight with Dracula.
Oh yeah, that's the most obvious one. Like, there's some fairly like some thematic stuff with like how the parasitic ruling class works nation to nation. That's not obvious. Like I feel like we've brought something to the table when we brainstorm this, which I just let Requiem spell it out because constantly interrupting him to mention what he already knows would have been dumb. But for the record, it was a lot of fun too. We've tried this a couple of times, and it usually works out pretty well when we try to rewrite an existing story. But I feel like Dracula went really well.
Yeah.
All right, hang on. I've got some XP that I need to spend on murder powers now.
On the topic of violent confrontations.
Yeah. We're going to save the game real quick, just in case.
Can't this area be, like, persuaded through, as I recall? Or stealth through, even?
Can. Stealth is much harder in this patch, if you don't have the right disciplines for it, which we don't.
Right.
Persuasion might work, but I'm going to assume that at some point stealth and or persuasion will fail us, and I will at that point have to murder everyone.
That's fair. You also probably want to make Mina a little more active. Like, I don't think she's the worst for, like, a novel from 1897. Like, I've read worse. Like, Tarzan was so much worse with the sexism, as we have discussed.
Dig up the Deep Jungle episodes from Kingdom Hearts if you want the deep cut on that one.
Oh boy, like it's not like it's about like it's I thought it was relatively okay. Like she she's like for 1897, like she does stuff. She is pretty important, and she does do some active stuff. Like she actively is the one who figures out what is going on with her going through all the documents with her archival skills.
Right.
But I think like you probably want to have her play a little more active role in the final confrontation rather than being pushed to the side because she's a woman.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never heard someone say this specifically because people don't tend to debate. Like, I don't think there's ever been a Dracula discourse before. I could see someone saying that Mina is basically a secretary and that's not okay. But I don't really think that's accurate. If someone did say that, I'm arguing with an imagined foe right here, to be clear, but yeah, that didn't work.
That's the straw man you're arguing with.
But yeah, Mina is not just the secretary; she is an archivist. Like, there's a difference there.
Like, in theory, that was the job. Like, she was being trained as a secretary. Like, that's the thing she got. But what she actually does, like, archival work.
Yeah, like that is what she contributes.
And, like, I don't know, like, you could raise the stakes by having her be brought to Dracula's fortress, and you could still have her, like, be doing something actively, like, within that to combat Dracula while the other guys are trying to break in. You could also switch who is the one. I do think you definitely need to raise the stakes. You have to have somebody be abducted. The obvious answer is Mina. You could have her be abducted and still be, like, not just a passive object. You could have her, like, be actively doing stuff in the castle. But you could also have, like, Van Helsing be the one abducted.
And Van Helsing is, I mean, people who are only familiar with him through his pop culture adaptations will think of Van Helsing as the most badass, but he is, like, a frail professor who knows a lot of supernatural shit in Dracula. So,
yeah.
Like, he is not helpless, but it would make perfect sense for him to be abducted. And it would help raise the stakes because he's the guy who knows what's going on.
Yeah.
While not being especially physically imposing. So now everyone else just has to make do with what they do know, which isn't very much. But, you know, they've been working with him for long enough that hopefully it will be enough.
We've also, so there's, Lucy has essentially 3 husbands. She's got 3 people she's romancing. She's got Dr. Seward, she's got Quincy Morris, and she's got Holmwood. And I think you just want to cut Holmwood out and make her fiancé be Morris, because, like, when Chamomile and I were discussing our Dracula rewrite, we completely forgot that Holmwood was a thing.
Yeah, no. It wasn't until I was, like, going back and, like, well, hang on. Mina is married to one of the guys, so she's, so that guy is obviously the real estate agent. I forget his name now, but he's obviously not a suitor for Lucy. And I know she had 3. So, like, you know, there is the awesome cowboy, the doctor, who is probably a better choice. And I blanked out completely on the 3rd one.
I'm personally of the opinion, because, like, I would just make it Quincy, just because that makes his death have a little more impact. And there's no reason, like, a doctor could get involved in this story without having to have a personal, intimate connection with Lucy.
Yeah, no, he could be treating Lucy. Because, you know, she's having a mysterious blood disease.
Quincy's involvement is kind of the weirdest of the 3. Like, it's like, why is he here? Like, Holmwood is engaged to her, and Seward is a doctor, and Quincy is an American adventurer who showed up for some reason.
Right. Like, he is the coolest character. You know, he is the dark horse supporting character who dies tragically in the end. That's gold. But he's definitely, you know, he seems to be in the plot for no better reason except that the writer also thinks that was gold.
So I do think you say Quincy was Lucy's fiancé, and that is why he is here. And then Seward was her doctor, and then everybody has a motivation to be here.
Yeah,
and then
it's been long enough since I've read this that I'm not sure if I'm remembering this accurately, but I do kind of feel like Lindsay. I do kind of feel like Lucy was the less grounded, sort of the more immature of the 2 between Lucy and Mina.
Yeah.
And so I feel like she is the kind who would marry an American adventurer because that's kind of romantic.
Hit you.
Something clipped through.
Oh, there's something in that room. Why'd you frenzy?
Because I ran out of blood. In fairness, I do need a drink. But also, holy shit, the frenzy effects are doing no favors to this already too dark game.
Oh boy. I think like if you kept Homewood in the story, you would want to you want him to betray the rest of the group. Like he's an aristocrat. The only thing he brought to the Scooby Gang was money, and if you're playing up the whole parasitic ruling class thing, I think he just betrays them.
Yeah, which that could be something. I want a flashlight. This game feels like it needs a flashlight option.
If you did that, I'm not sure it's even worth it. I honestly, cutting him is probably the best solution.
Okay, can I just like jump off here? Will that kill me? Oh, here's the stairs. I did not take note of where I was, what the time was when we started. So I am going to duck out to see how deep we are into the recording now. Expect a cut here. Can't feed on any of you assholes. But yeah, my initial thought was just to cut Homewood completely. If I were to actually try and write this, which is public domain, so I guess I could, I would probably at least toy with the idea of adding in Homewood as a traitor. But, that's kind of like, well, it could be cool if it works, and I feel like it's got a 30-40% chance of working. So you may as well try, but, I kind of half expect that to get cut at some point in editing.
Yeah, like wasn't the most uh-oh. He's not really that interesting.
These cops just apparently don't care at all that I've come to gawk at the brutal murder here. It is the world of darkness. Maybe, these murders are just so common that people have given up trying to dissuade people from coming to stare at them.
Dracula, it's like you said, like you can tell like the writing technology wasn't there. Like I feel like Dracula is one of those early novels where you can tell he had to write it by hand and did not have the ability to just instantly edit stuff, which I think like would have makes editing passes a lot easier. Like don't know what I would do if I had to write and just write it out and I had to like actually rewrite it.
Yeah,
like just make a slight edit.
Yeah, you're on a typewriter, so all of your writing is ink on a page, if not handwritten.
I feel like that is a
like my God.
Like I feel like that shows.
In fairness, I would do way less editing if I had to put up with that shit. Trying to make sure I don't miss anything, because I know this game pretty well. I've played it through a couple of times, but the last time I played through was like a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago now, and I'm talking to someone at the same time, so I don't want to accidentally end up real slim on XP at the end. I think I'm getting everything, though. Plus, the side quest, and this is real handy, the side quests in an area, A, they don't usually go obsolete, you can go back if you want, and B, they can be done in basically any order while you're in that area, and it still works thematically. So, I don't have to worry about completing a side quest before giving the astrolight to Mercurio or anything.
Yeah.
Alright, this is taking a while. We're going to start running. I'm just going to jump off the balcony here. The animation on that skirt is not fantastic, by the way.
I imagine. So I've decided the backstory for our character. She was actually a relatively uninteresting nerdy type who got invited to like one party and had a hookup and got turned into a vampire, and she's decided to go full tilt on it. Like, she's gonna lean into the vampirism. She's like, finally, I have the occult power I've always dreamed of. And
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
going to make
like-
use of it.
I didn't have any exact details figured out, but like I was positive going into it that like the opening cutscene, you know, is real vague, but it kind of implies that your sire embraces you without you knowing what's going on. I like to imagine that like she knew what was up, and like you know, not maybe not in detail, but she had figured out this guy was some kind of vampire, and like just flung herself at him to try and get in on that shit. Like, amateur occultist in way over her head is my basic premise for this character. Like, and like way too enthusiastic amateur occultist too. Alright, where do I want to go now? Actually, I should probably just deliver the astrolite to Mercurio. I'm starting to get good at hitting the use key instead of the feed key.
Not gonna drain the door of its blood.
Probably, like, I'm starting to talk to humans now, so, you know, I could totally end up fucking myself pretty bad if I get those confused.
Oh damn, did you die on me? Bram Stoker's like, I want to say his nephew. I don't think it's his direct descendant. Released like a official, and I'm saying official in quotes, sequel to Dracula, which, like, I'm not a big fan of that idea. Just because, like, the idea that you're related to this author means you get to have some ability to do an official sequel. It's kind of like, this is not something you pulled out of his notes and just wrote. This is less. You're using your surname to get a little money.
Yeah, it's...
And, like, admittedly, there was some stuff with copyright back when Bram Stoker's wife was still alive, where people kind of walked over the copyright that was, like, still pretty legitimate. But in 2009, I don't feel like you have any special claim to Dracula.
Yeah, no. It's the whole thing with copyright where it keeps... Not only does it keep stories legally under control of specific estates and prevent the broader community from, creating sequels, at which point the fan base will eventually settle on what the canon ones are based on what's good. That's how mythologies have worked, stretching back thousands of years. It's a very effective system. It's what gave us Arthuriana and Greek mythology and so forth. People act as though without copyright, well, then anyone will be able to make something, and, then all of it will be canon. No, it won't. The stuff that's dumb, people will decide it's not canon. Time will sift the wheat from the chaff. But it creates this culture, too, where even if something is not in copyright, people expect an IP, a fictional world, to be owned by someone, even if the original author is dead. And so people who have these blood relations or some other, ephemeral connection with the author become more prominent than they deserve within, that IP.
Like, Digger Stoker is Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew. And you get situations like Christopher Tolkien is J.R.R. Tolkien's son, and like some of the stuff he released was like legitimately based on like notes and stuff, and like pretty detailed stuff that J.R.R. Tolkien had come up with But then you get stuff like the Dune sequels, some of the Dune sequels after the Dune author died, which were co-written by his children, but eventually they're like, yeah, we basically just completely made this stuff up. We didn't actually leave any notes for us to base this on. It's like, and that's why they were so bad.
Right.
I think God Emperor of Dune is the last one that is legitimately written by the original author in any way. But like honestly, the best Dracula sequel is Interview with the Vampire. Like that did a lot with the idea of the vampire, added a lot, and is a legitimately good story on its own.
Oh yeah.
Like that's probably the best like modern vampire story.
No, Interview with the Vampire is like required reading if you want to be producing new vampire content.
I would say,
which is why, like, if they were telling the truth about having not read Interview with the Vampire until like the very end of production, then I would smack them upside the head for having not read Interview with the Vampire while writing a vampire RPG. You got to be familiar with the source material. Even if you're planning on taking it in a different direction, you at least got to know what they contributed to it.
Yeah. I just simply don't believe it. Like, there's so much that is obviously taken from Anne Rice that it just seems highly unlikely.
Right. Yeah, I don't either. Like, I do think they're just lying, but if they weren't, do I want to put a point of security to this? Nah, I'm just gonna blood buff myself. I'm starting to get thirsty. I should restock at some point.
In terms of modern vampire literature that I think is pretty good, Coldest Girl in Cold Town is amazing.
Like, I really like
Holly
that
Black. Holly Black, who also has an excellent vampire name.
Right?
Really knocked it out of the park with that one. Like, I've heard that the novel she then turned it into was not as good, but the short story is perfect.
Yeah, and I have not read the novel, but I did read the short story, and really good. Like, for a post-Masquerade world, like, if you want to have that concept, then there is some fantastic fodder for that concept in Coldest Girl in Cold Town. Oh, difficulty 5. Ooh. So in the original blood buff set your dexterity to 5, regardless of what it was. In the patch, it adds 2 to your dexterity, which means I will actually need to increase my lockpicking skill to pop that open. Ooh. I'll worry about that later. Right now, I'm just kind of bumming around hunting for side quests.
That's a problem for future chamomile.
Yes.
In terms of other vampire fiction, I actually just read a gay YA novel called The Fell of the Dark, which is another... It's not a post-Masquerade world, it's a no-Masquerade world. It was pretty enjoyable. It did feel like he had shoved too much plot into one single novel. Like, there's 5 vampire societies and, like, 3 people that this kid knows ends up having secret agendas, and it's like, it's too much for one novel. And I get that why you would do that, because you don't know that you're actually going to get to have a sequel, but for what is going on in the novel, it seems like he needed more time for some of this stuff to get revealed. But it was enjoyable. It was pretty light, but like it was a fun, light novel. It did what it wanted to do for the most part. The True Blood Vampire series is kind of a guilty pleasure for me. I've not read the Southern Vampire Mysteries, which it's based on and the series does kind of go off the rails towards the end, as these things tend to. But you know, it's a pretty good version of the paranormal romance, like compared to something like Twilight, which I'm sure we're going to talk about at some point.
Yeah, I mean, we brought it up.
uh, we don't have a ton of time left in the recording, so maybe next recording we'll talk about Twilight.
I mean, we've got 10 minutes, and we can go 5 or 10 minutes over if we want, so...
All right. So, Chamomile, what are your opinions on Twilight?
It's not great. So, Twilight came out, and then there was a backlash to Twilight, and then there was a backlash to the backlash against Twilight. And I would like to petition for a backlash to the backlash to the backlash against Twilight. Is that... regardless of how shitty your reasons for disliking Twilight were at the time, Twilight is still bad. In terms of writing and even, like, morally. It's not a great... like, it deserves its criticism as, like, sort of an anti-feminist piece of women's literature. And, obviously, that's not, like... no, Stephanie Meyer should not be arrested or anything. Like, it's not a crime. But it is kind of shitty.
Well, you get the thing, like, this is from both a writerly and a moral perspective. So Myers, like, the appeal of the vampire is danger. And Myers understands that, but she also is a little... the writing is clearly a little put off by the danger, which is why the vampires in Twilight are relatively defanged. So the whole danger element that makes the vampire appealing is kind of ruined. But then simultaneously, Edward is actually a pretty dangerous person. He is an abusive boyfriend.
Yeah, like, in a totally mundane way, Edward is very dangerous. Like, the red flags on that guy suggest that he is going to get violent at any second.
And it's got nothing to do with him being a vampire.
Yeah, it's not really, kind of, he just seems like the kind of guy who would hit a woman. And, like, to be clear here, like, I'm not just... it's not just because I dislike this book, and so I am imagining that this guy is going to do something bad. And let me specifically bring up the moment that really spells this out. In order to keep Bella from seeing friends that he does not approve of, including, if I'm remembering correctly, Jacob, who is, like, his rival suitor. So, a man over whom he would plausibly be jealous. He removes a part from her car, disables her car, so that she cannot choose to hang out with these friends of hers without his approval.
Yeah, that's just stop.
That should be absolutely terrifying. But it is instead played off as, like, regular relationship drama.
But then the whole vampire is shown as being, like, that's the thing that sees dangerous. But vampires in Twilight world, that's basically a straight upgrade over being a human. They seem perfectly fine feeding on animal blood. They don't really have any disadvantages. Edward angst about being damned, but all the things that would indicate a vampire being damned, he doesn't have. Like, he can go on holy ground. He doesn't hurt by holy water. He's not repelled by crucifixes. The sunlight doesn't really harm him. Like, if I became a vampire and none of these things happen, it's like, all right, well, I might be a vampire, but it doesn't look like I'm damned. Like, there's no actually negative effect of being a vampire. And you can do that, but it's clear, like, she wants the danger and the angst of being a vampire, but she's not actually willing to commit from it from a writerly perspective.
Right.
And so it kind of... he's not dangerous as a vampire, he's just dangerous as, like, he's a dangerous person.
You really don't see the criminal time.
Like,
Take a look.
there's nothing wrong with paranormal romance as a genre, and there's nothing wrong with, like, the, honestly, there's nothing wrong with even, like, the depressed nightmare demon boy. Like, there's an appeal of that, but he's a really bad example of that.
Yeah, the depressed nightmare demon boy... the whole thing is that there is an element of danger to him, but it is like this supernatural monstrous element. Twilight does occasionally, like, especially because it only ever comes up in later books, Twilight feels like it is occasionally remembering that it is supposed to be about vampires, about dangerous vampires, and so it has a vampire briefly be dangerous. It's never even Edward, though.
He just does the mundane, dangerous things.
Yeah.
And, like, the writing just isn't good. And, like, you can tell, like, so when the Twilight fandom was a thing, like, first book, Jacob was pretty popular as a character. And after that, like, he gets character assassinated by Myers. He becomes an Edward equivalent douchebag, and the general theory is that Myers did that because she did not like how popular Jacob was compared to Edward.
I mean, I believe it. I could also see the other way that might have gone down, is that she was trying to play into that, but, you know, she quote-unquote made him sexy by making him, you know, a petty asshole.
You have a point. Like, that's clearly her MO.
Oh, whoops.
Bring your associate, Mr. Durban, as it is a two-man job without
I'm glad people have these conversations out in public where we can hear them.
Yeah.
What'll it be, honey? You're the health inspector.
And then, like,
You know, at least the last health inspector had the decency to make it clear when he was asking for a bribe. Here's $50.
and this is not an issue with paranormal romance at all. I have nothing. I don't think either of us have anything against paranormal.
Oh,
romance.
yeah,
I like
absolutely
paranormal
not.
romance. The True Blood TV series, the first couple seasons are really good, and even the love triangle stuff works. Like, I have nothing against like that. It just Twilight is this very bad version of this.
Yeah, it's... Twilight irritates me because it has this huge first mover advantage in a perfectly good genre, but it's a really bad example of the genre.
Yeah.
I know I've heard that before. Oh, that girl. Nice girl. First
And then you have the whole question of why are a bunch of vampires hanging out at a high school?
Yeah.
Why would you do that to yourself if you didn't have to?
Like, it seems like it should be very easy for them to pass themselves off as college students. And
Like, they're all 18, so they can do that.
right. And, like, yeah, sure, that decreases the amount of time you can stay in one area by, like, a year. But is that much of a hassle? Like, I think going to high school would be significantly more annoying than having to move 1 year more often.
Yeah, high school. It's why would you purposely put yourself in high school when you can just, you know, pretend to be a college student? That's a very enjoyable time in most people's lives.
And it's also
And
it's
they're
very easy to
wealthy.
fake your way through it, right? Like,
Yeah.
no one is keeping tabs on you in college. You cannot sign up for any classes, claim that you have, and you'll probably get away with it.
And they're super rich anyways, and like there's a vampire conspiracy, so I feel like at college there's a lot more, and not universally, but colleges tend to be pretty big compared to high schools. You can have a lot more anonymity, and like in Vampire the Masquerade, like you want a herd, you can have a herd in a college pretty easily. Like
So this is a business.
Foxy Foxes.
But yes.
Like you could have
It's-
a character who's like you have a vampire frat boy and he just feeds on his fraternity brothers. And that works pretty well.
Yeah, and like okay, so for the target audience, you want a reason why Bella and Edward are both high school students. Like, I can imagine that being a valid concern, but like, come up with a reason then, you know? Do the work,
Yeah.
make this.
And I do have a Twilight revision, but I do think we are legitimately towards the end, so maybe we can get into that in the next episode.